The NVA commander had every reason to feel confident. 12 Americans had walked straight into a battalion-sized kill zone west of Loc Ninh, and 3 helicopter extraction attempts had already failed. His men had the numbers, somewhere around 400 against a 12-man Special Forces team, and they had the position. The Americans were pinned in triple canopy jungle with no clear landing zone, taking fire from at least 3 sides. By any reasonable calculation, this was already over. He was wrong. But we need to back up a few hours to understand why. On the morning of May 2, 1968, a long-range reconnaissance patrol from the 5th Special Forces Group inserted near the Cambodian border. Their job was simple: watch a known NVA supply corridor and report what moved through it. They were not supposed to make contact. Within hours, they were surrounded. The first radio transmissions back to Loc Ninh were calm, professional. Then the shooting started, and calm went out the window fast. If you've got family who served with 5th Group in '68, or you've heard stories about Loc Ninh that never made the official record, drop them in the comments. Hit like, subscribe. This one deserves the full telling. 3 separate Huey crews tried to get in. Each time, the volume of ground fire drove them back before they could reach the team. Rounds punched through tail booms, shattered plexiglass, chewed into rotor assemblies. One crew chief took fragments in the arm and kept working his gun until the pilot banked away. The extraction frequency was a mess of overlapping voices. Pilots calling damage reports, the team on the ground calling corrections, somebody at the operations center trying to coordinate all of it at once. According to the mission log, the phrase, "Get us out of here," appears 4 times in 11 minutes. Back at Loc Ninh, a staff sergeant named Roy Benavidez was monitoring the radio traffic from the operations area. He wasn't assigned to the mission. He wasn't on the duty roster for extraction support. He was recovering from a previous deployment injury, a landmine that had put fragments in both legs and nearly ended his career. The doctors had told him he probably wouldn't walk again. He'd spent a year proving them wrong, retraining himself to move and to function like a soldier again. The army had cleared him for duty, but nobody had him slotted for anything like this. What happened next is the part that doesn't make sense unless you understand one detail. When Benavidez heard those transmissions, heard the team dying in real time over the radio, he didn't grab a rifle. He grabbed a medical bag and a Bowie knife, ran to the flight line, and climbed into the door of a Huey that was spinning up for a 4th attempt. The med bag seemed like an odd choice. It wasn't. The U.S. Army nearly rejected Roy Benavidez twice before he became the most decorated Green Beret of the war. He came from El Campo, Texas, a small town south of Houston where the main industries were cotton and cattle. His father was a Mexican farmer who died young. His mother, Yaqui Indian, followed not long after. Both were gone before Roy turned 7. An uncle named Nicholas took him in, and the kid grew up picking cotton and sugar beets alongside migrant workers to help the family survive. He dropped out of school at 15, not because he was stupid, because the family needed the money, and because other kids called him a dumb Mexican, often enough that leaving felt easier than staying. He later said the dropout was the decision he regretted most in his life, more than anything that happened in combat. He enlisted in 1955 at 17. The army was the best option available, possibly the only option, and Benavidez took to it the way certain people take to structure when they've never had any. He made staff sergeant and qualified for airborne. By 1965, he was on his first tour in Vietnam as an advisor with an ARVN infantry unit operating near the Cambodian border, the same corridor he'd returned to 3 years later under very different circumstances. Then he stepped on a landmine. The blast drove fragments into both legs and damaged his spine. He was evacuated to Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, where the prognosis was blunt. He'd likely never walk again, and the Army's Physical Evaluation Board would almost certainly process him out with a medical discharge. This is worth a brief sidebar, because the PEB system in the mid-1960s was a machine built for volume, not exceptions. The war was producing casualties faster than the bureaucracy could handle them, and the default setting was discharge. A soldier who couldn't pass a physical fitness test within a set recovery window got paperwork, a disability rating, and a bus ticket home. The system wasn't cruel exactly. It just wasn't designed to account for a man who refused to accept what 3 doctors had told him. Anyway, Benavidez spent months doing unauthorized physical therapy. The word unauthorized matters. He was sneaking out of bed at night to practice standing, then walking, then dragging himself down hospital corridors when the staff wasn't watching. The official recovery plan had him in a wheelchair. He had a different plan. By 1966, he was walking. By 67, he'd passed every physical requirement the Army could throw at him and volunteered for Special Forces selection at Fort Bragg. Look at the timeline. 2 years from You'll Never Walk Again to the Special Forces Qualification Course, one of the most physically demanding pipelines in the U.S. military. The Q course didn't care about his backstory or his medical miracle. It cared whether he could hump a rucksack through Pisgah National Forest for days without quitting. He could. After earning the Green Beret, Benavidez was assigned to Detachment B-56, 5th Special Forces Group, operating out of Loc Ninh in Bin Long Province. B-56 ran classified cross-border reconnaissance missions into Cambodia and Laos, the kind the U.S. government publicly denied were happening. The teams were small, typically 1 or 2 American Special Forces soldiers paired with 8 to 10 indigenous fighters, mostly Nung Chinese or Montagnard tribesmen from the Central Highlands. The indigenous soldiers knew the jungle better than anyone wearing an American uniform ever would. The Green Berets who worked alongside them didn't pretend otherwise. The relationship was professional, frequently close, held together by the particular kind of trust that forms when everyone involved knows the extraction helicopter might not come. The team that inserted on May 2nd included several of these indigenous soldiers. Their names appear in some records but not others. The Army's paperwork from this period is inconsistent on the subject, a pattern that frustrated historians for decades. Benavidez wasn't on that team. He was back at the operations base, doing routine work, listening to the radio. A staff sergeant with a medical file that said he shouldn't even be in country. The PEB had almost sent him home with a disability check and a thank you letter. Instead, he was about to board a helicopter with a medical bag and a knife. The jungle west of Loc Ninh smelled like wet decay, rotting leaves, standing water, vegetation so thick it broke down into black paste underfoot. Triple canopy meant 3 layers of foliage between the ground and the sky, and at floor level the light came through green and dim, like being at the bottom of a pond. Sightlines ran maybe 20 meters before the wall of green shut everything down. A man could be standing 40 feet away, and you wouldn't know it until he moved. 12 men were moving through this on the morning of May 2nd. 3 Americans, 9 indigenous strikers, Nung Chinese fighters who'd been working with Special Forces long enough to know the border corridor cold. The mission was a standard B-56 profile. Insert by helicopter. Move to an observation point along a known NVA supply route. Watch and report for 48 to 72 hours. Extract quietly. No contact. The whole point was to never be seen. The NVA had other plans. What the team didn't know, couldn't have known, was that an infantry battalion had been operating in the area for weeks. Estimates after the fact put the strength somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 men. The numbers are imprecise because the intelligence picture in that part of Bin Long province was terrible in the spring of '68. Tet had scrambled collection efforts across the entire country, and the cross-border corridors near Cambodia were among the worst gaps. So the team walked into an area that higher headquarters had assessed as moderate risk, and the assessment was wrong by a factor of about 100 to 1. The first shots came fast and from close range. A K-fire, then automatic weapons from multiple positions. The NVA had set a textbook L-shaped ambush, one element firing from the front to pin the team in place, a second element hitting from the flank to prevent withdrawal. Within minutes, the team leader was down. Then a second American was hit. The Nung strikers fought hard. They always did, and they don't get enough credit for it in the American telling of this story. But the volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. Rounds snapped through the undergrowth so continuously it sounded like fabric tearing. The team tried to pull back toward a small clearing, the closest thing to a landing zone within reach, and the NVA followed them. 3 Hueys came in for extraction. Each one took heavy fire on approach. Rounds walked up fuselages and cracked canopies, punched clean through hydraulic lines. The pilots were brave, nobody disputes that, but bravery doesn't change ballistics. At a certain density of ground fire, a helicopter hovering at treetop level is just a target. All 3 were driven off with damage. One barely made it back to Loc Ninh. On the ground, the radio operator was calling for help on a frequency that was getting increasingly crowded with bad news. The team was being compressed into a tighter and tighter perimeter. Ammunition was running low. The men who could still shoot were burning through magazines trying to keep the NVA from closing the final distance. Back at Loc Ninh, Roy Benavidez was at a prayer service on the base. A Sunday morning. He heard the helicopters winding up on the flight line. Then the radio traffic started filtering through from the operations center. Broken transmissions, urgent voices, the particular tone that career soldiers recognize immediately. Something had gone very wrong across the border. He left the service and went to find out what was happening. 6 hours later, he would be lying in a body bag, covered in blood, unable to speak, holding his intestines in with his hand. But that was 6 hours later. Get us out of here. The transmission came through raw and unfiltered. No call signs, no protocol, just a man's voice stripped down to the one thing that mattered. Benavidez heard it from across the compound. The operations center had the frequency up loud enough that you could catch fragments from 30 meters out. He was already moving toward the sound before he'd fully processed what he was hearing. The situation on the radio was worse than bad. The team leader was dead or dying. At least 2 other Americans were hit. The Nung strikers were still fighting, but the perimeter was collapsing inward, and the NVA battalion was tightening the noose with the patience of men who knew they had the numbers. 3 helicopter crews had already tried and failed. A 4th Huey was spinning up on the pad, crew chief waving frantically, rotors kicking red laterite dust across the flight line. Benavidez grabbed the medical bag, the same one from every retelling of this story. He didn't reach for a weapon. He took a bag full of bandages and morphine syrettes and a Bowie knife on his belt. That was it. A staff sergeant with a spine full of old shrapnel, no rifle, running toward a helicopter that was already lifting off. He hauled himself through the cargo door while the skids were leaving the ground. The flight west took minutes. Below the canopy, the team was running out of time in a way that couldn't be measured in hours anymore. Minutes, maybe less. The Huey came in over the tree line and immediately started taking fire, the same wall of AK and automatic weapons that had driven off every aircraft before it. The pilot, a warrant officer whose name appears in some accounts, but not the official citation, tried to find a gap in the canopy wide enough to set down. There wasn't one. The small clearing the team had fallen back to was barely big enough for a helicopter to hover over, and the NVA had guns trained on every inch of it, so Benavidez jumped. The estimates on height vary. The citation says approximately 30 feet. Other accounts say closer to 50. Either way, it was high enough that the helicopter crew thought he was going to die on impact. According to testimony given during the Medal of Honor review, the door gunner later said he watched Benavidez disappear into the vegetation and was certain he'd been killed. The gunner kept firing anyway, pouring suppressive bursts into the tree line, because that was the job regardless of what had just happened to the man who jumped out of his aircraft without a parachute or a plan that made any kind of tactical sense. Benavidez hit the ground and started running. 75 meters of open space between where he landed and where the surviving team members were clustered. 75 meters is about 2/3 the length of a football field, which doesn't sound far until every meter of it is being swept by direct fire from soldiers who can see you moving. He made it roughly halfway before an AK round hit him in the right leg. He kept going. Fragments from a grenade or a near-miss round caught him in the face and head. He kept going. I think about this part more than any other detail in the entire story. A man with no weapon, already bleeding from his leg, shrapnel in his face, crossing open ground toward a position that every pilot who'd seen it from the air had already judged to be indefensible, and he's carrying bandages. The rational calculation says, stop, fall down. You've been hit, you have no rifle, the men you're trying to reach are probably already dead. None of it adds up to keep running. He reached the first survivor and started applying pressure to a wound. Around him, the Nung fighters who were still alive shifted their fire to cover his movement. The NVA were close enough now that Benavidez could hear individual voices through the undergrowth, shouting commands in Vietnamese. The clock was running. The helicopter above him couldn't hover forever. 7 wounds in 90 seconds. That's the count from the Medal of Honor citation. And even allowing for the fog of battlefield documentation, the number is staggering. Right leg gunshot, shrapnel across the face, fragment wounds to the head and back. By the time Benavidez reached the team's position, he was already bleeding from more places than most soldiers get hit in an entire tour. He didn't stop to assess his own injuries. The after-action report is specific on this point. Benavidez went straight to the team leader's body, retrieved the classified documents and operational maps, and shoved them into his shirt. This seems like a strange priority for a man who's bleeding out in a firefight, but the logic was ironclad. B-56 missions didn't officially exist. The maps showed infiltration routes, extraction coordinates, rally points for teams that were still operating across the border. If the NVA recovered those documents, every SOG team in the corridor was compromised. Men who were asleep in their bunkers at Loch Ninh that morning would die next week because of paperwork left on a body in Cambodia. Benavides understood this, so documents first, then triage. He picked up an AK-47 from a dead NVA soldier. Now he had a weapon. The perimeter, if you could call it that, was maybe 15 meters across. The men still fighting included Nung strikers who'd been in contact for over an hour by this point, burning through ammunition they couldn't replace, taking casualties they couldn't evacuate. These were professional soldiers. The American narrative of this battle tends to compress them into background, unnamed figures supporting the main character. But that's wrong, and the record should say so. The Nung fighters held their positions when the L-shaped ambush hit. They maintained fire discipline when the helicopters couldn't extract them. Several of them died in that clearing without any expectation that their names would appear in an American newspaper or be read aloud in a ceremony at the Pentagon. According to the records that do exist, at least 4 indigenous strikers were killed during the engagement. The actual number was probably higher. Benavides moved between them with the medical bag, bandaging wounds, administering morphine, pulling ammunition off the dead, redistributing it to the living. He directed fire toward the tree line where the NVA pressure was heaviest, shifting men to cover gaps as the perimeter shrank. The captured AK gave him maybe 30 rounds, a magazine and change, not enough to hold anything for long. An NVA soldier broke through the brush line at close range. Benavides shot him. Another followed almost immediately. The fighting at this distance wasn't tactical anymore. It was physical, close enough to smell the other man, close enough that the muzzle flash left powder burns. Above the canopy, the helicopter pilots were circling and watching the situation deteriorate in real time. The radio calls from the ground were getting shorter, more clipped, the transmissions of men who didn't have breath to waste on full sentences. Benavides was calling in the team's position, requesting another extraction attempt, and simultaneously trying to keep wounded men from bleeding to death. The medical bag was half empty, and the ammunition situation was worse. The NVA commander still had several hundred fresh soldiers in the tree line who hadn't yet been committed to the assault. Benavides keyed the handset and called for fire on his own position. The words in the transmission were simple: grid coordinates, followed by the advisory that friendlies were at the center of the target area. The forward air controller circling above would have understood immediately what was being asked. Danger close isn't a suggestion, it's a formal declaration that the man on the ground knows the ordnance is going to land near enough to kill him, and he's requesting it anyway. For helicopter gunship rockets, the minimum safe distance was normally 200 meters. Benavides was asking for runs at a fraction of that. The NVA were so close to the perimeter that any meaningful separation between friendly and enemy positions had ceased to exist. Look at the math. A 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rocket has a bursting radius that throws fragments across a roughly 35-meter circle. The perimeter Benavides was defending was 15 meters wide. The NVA assault line was, at points, less than 10 meters from the men he was trying to protect. There is no targeting solution that threads that needle cleanly. The calculation isn't, will friendlies get hit? The calculation is, will enough of us survive the rockets to still be alive when the helicopters try again? That's the arithmetic of danger close. You're not avoiding friendly casualties. You're gambling that the alternative is worse. The gunships came in low and fast. Rockets walked across the tree line in overlapping bursts, shredding vegetation and throwing columns of dirt and splintered wood into the air. The noise was physical. Pressure waves that hit the chest before the sound reached the ears. NVA soldiers caught in the open were killed instantly. Others who had been using the heavy undergrowth as concealment found that the undergrowth no longer existed. For a few seconds, the volume of incoming small arms fire dropped, and in that brief window, Benavides redistributed his surviving men to cover the gaps the rockets had blown in the NVA assault line. Seconds. That's what the air support bought, seconds of reduced pressure before the NVA adjusted. The enemy needs honest assessment here. The battalion attacking Benavides's position was not a collection of irregular fighters operating on enthusiasm. These were North Vietnamese Army regulars executing a deliberate attack with fire and maneuver tactics that would have been recognizable at any infantry school in the world. They established a base of fire. They maneuvered assault elements forward under that covering fire. When the gunship runs disrupted one axis of advance, they shifted to another. Their junior leaders, the platoon and squad commanders directing movement through the shattered tree line, were making real-time adjustments under air attack without breaking contact. According to the after-action assessment, The NVA maintained unit cohesion throughout the entire engagement, despite taking significant casualties from the airstrikes. Most retellings skip past the word cohesion. Maintaining cohesion under rocket attack means your sergeants are still giving orders, and your soldiers are still following them, while pieces of the jungle are falling on their heads. Benavidez called in a second run, then a third, each time the rockets landed closer to his own position. Each time the NVA pulled back momentarily, reorganized, and came forward again with what the citation describes as increasing intensity. The phrase is almost admiring. The men who wrote the official paperwork recognized what they were seeing on the other side. Between gunship passes, the fighting on the ground was hand-to-hand in places. Benavidez took a round through his left arm. He shifted the handset to his right hand and kept calling adjustments. A fragment, rocket or grenade, the documentation doesn't distinguish, hit him in the thigh. He was now bleeding from wounds he'd stopped counting. The NVA commander fed fresh troops into the assault. The perimeter, already too small to defend by any conventional standard, shrank again. Bodies from both sides lay within meters of each other. Benavidez was simultaneously directing airstrikes, returning fire with the captured AK, treating wounded men, and dragging casualties toward the center of the clearing, where a helicopter might be able to reach them. The gunships were running low on ordnance. When they broke station to rearm, the full weight of the battalion would fall on whatever was left of 12 men in a clearing the size of a tennis court. The clearing was maybe 20 meters long and chewed to mud. Shattered tree stumps, spent brass, bodies. The vegetation that had ringed it 2 hours earlier was gone, stripped to splinters by rocket runs and automatic weapons fire until the space looked less like jungle and more like something left after a tornado hit a lumberyard. The Huey came in through a gap in the canopy that hadn't existed before the gunships made it. The pilot held the aircraft in a hover just above the ground, skids barely touching the torn earth, rotors throwing a cyclone of debris and smoke outward in every direction. Benavidez was already moving. He had a wounded man under each arm, dragging them backward toward the open cargo doors, his legs failing in ways he could feel but couldn't afford to acknowledge. An NVA soldier came through the shattered brush line at a dead sprint, rifle up. Benavidez dropped the wounded man on his left side, pulled the Bowie knife from his belt, and met him. The fight lasted seconds. The knife went into the NVA soldier's midsection. Benavidez pulled it free and turned back to the helicopter. 2 more NVA had broken cover to the right, both oriented toward the cockpit, both raising weapons toward the pilot. Benavidez killed them before they could fire. The surviving crew member aboard the aircraft, Specialist 4 Brian O'Connor, later described what he saw from the cargo bay. He was covered in blood. I didn't understand how he was standing. He was fighting with a knife and loading men onto the helicopter at the same time. And I remember thinking this isn't possible. Nobody does this. Then the bayonet hit him. An NVA soldier drove the blade into Benavidez's back from behind. He spun and fought the man off. Before he could recover, another soldier clubbed him across the head with a rifle butt hard enough to fracture bone. Benavidez went down. He got back up. A round punched through his right thigh, the same leg that had taken the first bullet hours earlier. No doctor who reviewed his injuries afterward could explain how he kept standing. He loaded the last of the wounded and counted bodies in the helicopter. Then he climbed aboard. The Huey pulled pitch and clawed upward through the broken canopy, taking fire the entire way, rounds punching through the aluminum skin of the fuselage. Below them, the NVA battalion was still shooting at an aircraft that was already above the trees. 37 separate wounds, 6 hours on the ground. The medical team at Loch Ninh would take one look at him and reach for a body bag. I thought he was dead. Everybody thought he was dead. That's Jerry Cottingham, the FOB operations sergeant, describing what came off the helicopter at Loch Ninh. The medevac team had seen bad casualties before. This was 1968, and the base handled wounded from across the border on a regular rotation. But the figure on the helicopter floor didn't look like a casualty. He looked like a corpse that had been through a wood chipper. Blood had soaked through every layer of clothing and pooled beneath him on the cargo bay floor. His eyes were closed. His jaw hung slack. No visible respiration. The medics who pulled him from the aircraft didn't check for a pulse. They checked for a body bag. They found one. The triage protocol at a forward operating base during heavy contact was blunt by necessity. Wounded men who could survive got treatment. Wounded men who couldn't were made comfortable and moved aside. Dead men went into bags so the living didn't have to look at them while they worked. The medic who lifted Benavidez off the helicopter floor and laid him on the ground made a judgment call based on what his eyes and hands told him. No movement, no response to voice, blood loss so extreme that the skin had gone gray-white beneath the red. By every visible indicator, Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez was killed in action. The zipper started at his feet and moved upward. Standard procedure. Bag the remains, tag them, move to the next casualty who might still need you. The zipper reached his chest, then his neck. Benavidez spit in the doctor's face. It was the only thing his body could still do. His arms wouldn't respond, and his legs were finished. Speech was impossible. His jaw had taken a rifle butt hard enough to crack bone, and the soft tissue damage to his mouth and throat ruled out vocalization entirely. But somewhere behind the blood and the shock and the gray curtain of hemorrhagic collapse, the signal got through. The lizard brain, the part that doesn't negotiate, fired one last instruction to the only muscles still answering. His diaphragm contracted, his throat closed, and he projected a mouthful of blood and saliva into the face of the man who was about to zip him into the dark. The doctor froze. Then he started cutting away clothing and calling for plasma. So what does 37 wounds across 6 hours actually do to a human body? The blood loss alone is nearly incomprehensible. An average man carries roughly 5 liters of blood. Benavidez had gunshot wounds to both legs, his left arm, his abdomen. Fragment wounds covered his head, face, back, and shoulders. A bayonet had punctured his left arm, and another had gone into his back deep enough to penetrate muscle tissue. Each wound bled. Some bled fast, some slow, but all of them bled continuously for hours without surgical intervention, without transfusion, without even the basic compression bandaging that a man needs 2 free hands to apply to himself. The attending physician at Loc Ninh later estimated that Benavidez had lost more blood than his circulatory system should have contained, accounting for the plasma expanders administered during initial treatment. The math doesn't work. It didn't need to. He was alive. Luck doesn't explain surviving that kind of damage. Conditioning does. The man on that table had spent a year at Fort Bragg, rebuilding himself from a broken back that 3 doctors said would never heal. He had done it by force, walking when they told him to use the wheelchair, running when they told him to walk, pushing a body that medical science had written off until it performed beyond the parameters of its own injury report. That year of defiance had built a cardiovascular system and a pain tolerance that operated outside normal physiological expectations. His resting heart rate was low, and his blood pressure regulation was efficient. His body knew how to function in oxygen debt because he had trained it there deliberately, grinding through physical therapy sessions that left him passed out on the floor of the rehab ward. The doctors at Loc Ninh worked on him for hours. He would spend almost a year in hospitals, recovering from the wounds sustained in a single afternoon. September 1968. 6 months after the clearing, 4 months after the last surgery, Benavidez stood in a dress uniform that covered most of the scars and received the Distinguished Service Cross. The DSC is the nation's second highest award for valor. It sits one step below the Medal of Honor on a hierarchy that matters enormously to the Army and almost not at all to anyone who has actually been in combat. The citation was detailed enough. It mentioned the wounds, the hand-to-hand fighting, the repeated helicopter extractions under fire. What it didn't capture was the smell of the clearing, cordite and copper and the wet iron stink of blood soaking into laterite mud and shredded vegetation. The citation doesn't carry smell. A ribbon pinned to a chest by a general officer in a clean room on a stateside post is the Army's best attempt at translating 6 hours of dying into something that fits inside a velvet box. It wasn't enough. Everybody involved knew it wasn't enough. The problem was paperwork. The Medal of Honor requires a specific evidentiary threshold, sworn eyewitness statements from U.S. military personnel who directly observed the actions in question. The regulation is rigid by design. You don't hand out the nation's highest military decoration on hearsay, but the regulation created an absurd catch. The Americans on the ground that day were either dead or wounded so severely that they had been evacuated through multiple hospitals and scattered across the medical system. Several could not be located for follow-up interviews. The indigenous team members, Nung and Montagnard fighters, who had been right there, who had watched Benavidez drag their wounded bodies across that clearing, didn't qualify as witnesses under Army regulations. Their testimony, however detailed, however consistent, did not meet the administrative standard. Men who bled alongside Benavidez, who would have died without him, whose statements corroborated every detail of what happened. Their word wasn't good enough because of a bureaucratic category. That should bother you. So the DSC stood. The Army classified significant portions of the operational records because the mission had occurred across the border in Cambodia, which the United States was not officially operating in. The classification meant that even the evidence that did exist became difficult to access. Benavidez went back to duty, served 8 more years, and retired in 1976 as a master sergeant. He went home to El Campo, Texas with a pension, a box of medals, a back that still ached from the injury the Army had once told him would end his career, and no expectation that any of it would be revisited. The story should have been over. A retired Special Forces sergeant in a small Texas town, mowing his lawn with 37 scars hidden under a cotton shirt. The Army had given him what the paperwork allowed. The files were locked. The witnesses who counted were gone, and the witnesses who remained didn't count. The gap between what Roy Benavidez did on the 2nd of May, 1968, and what the nation acknowledged he did on that date, that gap was fixed, permanent. Except one man hadn't been found yet. The records from 1968 listed a crew member aboard the extraction helicopter as evacuated to a field hospital and subsequently transferred. No forwarding unit and no follow-up interview. No sworn statement taken. His file sat in a personnel archive, unread, for over a decade. The Medal of Honor upgrade happened because a man bought a newspaper in the wrong country at the right time. That sentence sounds invented. It isn't. Brian O'Connor had survived. Benavidez didn't know that. The last time he had seen O'Connor was inside the cargo bay of the extraction helicopter, both of them bleeding, the airframe shuddering under ground fire as the pilot hauled collective and dragged them above the canopy. After that, hospitals, transfers, the administrative machinery of a military medical system processing thousands of casualties per month across multiple theaters. O'Connor was evacuated stateside, underwent treatment, and eventually separated from the Army. He left the United States entirely. By the late 1970s, he was living in Fiji, working civilian jobs, carrying the 2nd of May, 1968, somewhere in the back of his skull, the way combat veterans carry things. Not gone, not healed, just stored in a room he didn't open unless something forced the door. Nothing forced the door for 12 years. 1980. O'Connor took a holiday trip to Australia. Routine, unremarkable. The kind of break an expatriate takes when he wants to see a city with paved roads and cold beer and English-language bookstores. He was sitting in a cafe, and here is where the story bends into territory that would get rejected from a screenplay for being too convenient. And he picked up an Australian newspaper. Somewhere in the back pages, a wire service piece described an American soldier named Roy Benavidez, who had performed extraordinary actions during a classified mission in Vietnam and received the Distinguished Service Cross. The article mentioned that efforts to upgrade the award to the Medal of Honor had stalled because a key eyewitness could not be located. O'Connor was reading about himself. The geometry of this moment is staggering. A former Special Forces soldier living on an island in the South Pacific, on a casual trip to a different country, encounters a newspaper article about a battle he fought in 12 years earlier, on the opposite side of the planet, in a war his own government had classified portions of, and recognizes that he is the missing piece the Army needs. The odds against this chain of events completing itself are astronomical. If O'Connor doesn't travel to Australia that month, if he picks up a different newspaper, if the wire service doesn't run that particular story, if the editor cuts it for space, any single break in the sequence, and Roy Benavidez dies a retired master sergeant with a DSC and a story that the bureaucracy had already filed and forgotten. O'Connor didn't hesitate. He contacted Benavidez directly. The phone call between them. The records don't give us the exact words. What we know is that O'Connor identified himself, confirmed he was alive, and told Benavidez he was willing to provide a sworn eyewitness statement detailing everything he had observed on the 2nd of May, 1968. Everything. The approach to the clearing, the ground fire, Benavidez running through automatic weapons fire to reach the wounded, the hand-to-hand combat at the helicopter, the knife work, the bayonet wounds. The moment Benavidez kept fighting after taking damage that should have killed any normal man twice over. O'Connor had watched all of it from the cargo bay, close enough to see the blood on Benavidez's hands, and he had spent 12 years carrying that testimony inside him with nobody from the United States Army asking for it, because nobody knew where he was, because the system that was supposed to track him had lost him in the transfer pipeline, and nobody went looking. 12 years of a sworn statement sitting inside a living witness while the Army shrugged and said the evidentiary standard couldn't be met. I think about the bureaucratic absurdity of that, and it makes my teeth hurt. O'Connor's statement was detailed and specific, corroborating the existing record point by point, while adding observational detail that only someone physically present in that helicopter could have provided. He described Benavides's wounds in sequence, the volume of enemy fire during the extraction, and what it looked like to watch Benavides fight with a knife while dragging casualties, his uniform so saturated with blood that O'Connor initially couldn't tell which injuries were Benavides's and which belonged to the men he was carrying. The statement ran to multiple pages of sworn testimony. The Army reopened the case. Fred Barbie, a retired lieutenant colonel who had served with Benavides, had been quietly pushing the upgrade for years, writing letters, contacting congressional offices, assembling whatever documentation the classification system allowed him to access. Barbie had hit the same wall every time. No qualifying eyewitness, no upgrade. The regulation didn't bend. But O'Connor's reappearance changed the evidentiary landscape completely. A living American service member, present during the action, willing to swear under oath. The wall that had held for 12 years dissolved in a single affidavit. The case moved to the Pentagon for review. For the first time since September 1968, the question wasn't whether Roy Benavides deserved the Medal of Honor. The question was how fast the paperwork could catch up to what everybody already knew. February 24, 1981, 13 years, 9 months, and 22 days after Staff Sergeant Roy Benavides ran across a clearing with a medical bag and a knife. The Pentagon courtyard was cold. Washington in February carries a specific kind of chill, damp, gray, the wind cutting across the Potomac and finding every gap in a dress uniform. Benavides stood in that wind wearing every ribbon the Army had given him, and the man pinning the Medal of Honor around his neck was a president who had been in office for exactly 35 days. Reagan knew what he had. A story this good doesn't need embellishment, it needs a stage. The new administration had inherited a country that was still, a decade after the fall of Saigon, deeply uncomfortable with the men it had sent to Vietnam. Veterans were politically inconvenient. Their war had no tidy narrative, no satisfying moral architecture, and the bureaucracy that processed their service reflected that ambivalence at every level. Awards delayed, records classified, medical claims disputed. The message, whether intended or not, was consistent. The less said about Vietnam, the better. Reagan wanted to say more. According to the accounts from that ceremony, Reagan stopped partway through reading the citation aloud. He looked up from the text and addressed the assembled press directly. "If the story of his heroism were a movie script," he said, "you would not believe it." The line landed because it was true. The citation read like fiction. A man sustaining 37 wounds over 6 hours while saving 8 lives, fighting hand to hand, calling fire on his own position, being zipped into a body bag and spitting his way back out. No screenwriter would pitch that. The notes would come back saying tone it down, make it plausible. But Reagan wasn't just telling a war story. Look at the timing. 35 days into a presidency built on restoring American confidence after the hostage crisis in Iran, after the malaise of the Carter years, after a decade of national self-doubt. Benavides was the antidote, and Reagan understood narrative the way a former actor understands blocking. You put the right man in the right light and let the moment do the rest. The irony is almost too neat. The army that Benavides had served, that he had bled for until his circulatory system ran on fumes and willpower, had nearly buried him in its own filing system. The evidentiary standard that was supposed to protect the integrity of the Medal of Honor had instead protected the bureaucracy from having to process an inconvenient truth. A cross-border mission into a country the U.S. wasn't supposed to be operating in, run alongside indigenous fighters whose testimony didn't meet administrative criteria. Records were classified to avoid political embarrassment. The system didn't fail despite working correctly. It failed because it worked correctly. Every regulation performed exactly as designed, and the result was that the most extraordinary act of individual valor in the Vietnam War went unrecognized for over a decade. That medical bag. The detail keeps circling back. Benavides grabbed it off the helicopter floor before he jumped. No weapon, no helmet, just a canvas sack full of bandages and morphine syrettes. 3 men told him not to go. The helicopter crew thought he was insane. The bag was the whole statement of intent. He wasn't going out there to fight. He was going out there to keep people alive long enough to get them home. The fighting was what happened when the jungle wouldn't let him do the other thing. 8 men survived that clearing because of what was in the bag and what was in the man carrying it. Reagan placed the medal around Benavides's neck. The ceremony lasted minutes. The paperwork had taken 13 years. "I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me," Benavidez told an audience at Fort Bragg sometime in the late 1980s. The exact date varies depending on which account you read. The words don't. The ones you should feel sorry for are the ones who didn't come home. He spent the last 17 years of his life saying versions of that sentence to anyone who would listen. School assemblies, veterans of foreign wars halls, special forces reunions, congressional hearings on veterans' benefits. The Medal of Honor turned him into a public figure, which was a strange fit for a man who had spent most of his career in units that didn't officially exist, running missions into countries the United States wasn't officially in. Benavidez adapted. He was good at adapting. The army had told him he'd never walk again, and he ran 2 miles the next morning on sheer spite. Public speaking was easier than that. He died on November 29, 1998, at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio. Complications from diabetes. He was 63. The wounds from the clearing had never fully healed. Scar tissue doesn't behave like normal tissue, and 37 entry and exit wounds leave a body that functions but never quite forgives. He is buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery, which sits about 160 miles from the house in El Campo, where he grew up picking cotton and sugar beets as an orphan. The Special Forces community adopted the call sign Tango Mike Mike after Benavidez's death. The letters stand for "That Mean Mexican," a nickname Benavidez used for himself, delivered with the kind of grin that dares you to be offended. The Navy named a ship after him, the Army put his name on buildings, and his face went on a postage stamp in 2000. These things mattered to institutions. Whether they mattered to Roy Benavidez is a question nobody alive can answer with certainty. What doesn't get stamped on anything is the Nung and Montagnard fighters, the 12-man team that walked into the jungle west of Loch Ninh on the 2nd of May, 1968, included indigenous soldiers whose names appear in the operational records only as roster entries. No biographical detail, no hometown, no next of kin listed in any archive accessible to researchers. According to the after-action report, several were killed in the initial ambush. The survivors fought alongside Benavidez for 6 hours. Their testimony about what happened in the clearing was consistent, detailed, and rejected by the Army's evidentiary process because of the administrative category those men occupied. They bled in the same mud. The paperwork didn't care. The NVA battalion commander, his name doesn't appear in the declassified American records, and the Vietnamese archives from that period remain largely inaccessible to Western researchers, had set a textbook ambush. Interlocking fields of fire, superior numbers, prepared positions, pre-registered mortar coordinates. Everything worked. The 12-man team was shattered in the first minutes. 3 extraction helicopters were driven off by concentrated ground fire. The kill zone functioned exactly as designed against 12 men. The variable the plan didn't account for was the 13th. A staff sergeant with no weapon, no helmet, carrying a canvas medical bag he'd grabbed off the helicopter. Floor because the men on the ground were calling for a medic and the actual medics were either dead or pinned down. The crew chief told him not to go. The pilot told him not to go. Benavidez jumped from a hovering Huey into automatic weapons fire and spent the next 6 hours refusing to die in terms so specific and so violent that the Army's own citation reads like it was written by someone who couldn't quite believe the debriefing. O'Connor, the witness who made the Medal of Honor possible, gave an interview years later. He described watching Benavidez from the helicopter cargo bay, bleeding, fighting, dragging bodies, taking rounds, and getting back up. The interviewer asked O'Connor what he remembered most clearly. O'Connor said it was the moment Benavidez reached the tree line carrying a wounded man over his shoulder, took a rifle butt to the face, and just kept moving forward like it was the only direction that existed.